In myths, vineyards and wine symbolized the achievements of civilization. Viticulture and winemaking were viewed as creative processes, even in a cosmic sense. Viticulturalists and winemakers played an exemplary cultural role in creating order from chaos, transforming something from nature into a triumph of civilization. You can find that passage on page 4 of Arthur George's book, The Mythology of Wine. And I just want to offer how much I appreciate the metaphors at play here around creativity and how this passage connects the creative process with turning water into wine, right? An image which the book discusses in detail on pages 118 to 121. And with that, I am delighted to welcome you to today's Myth Lit webinar, hosted by the Fates and Graces, for the myth community to read together and celebrate the field of mythological literature. I'm Joanna Gardner from the Fates and Graces team. Stephanie Zachowski is here also, and we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Arthur George to Myth Lit. Art has been a stalwart in our community ever since the very first Mythologium back in 2019. And he even served as our sommelier at the 2023 Mythologium last summer. And he even shared some of his own wines with us, which makes it that much more joyful for us to talk about his book today, The Mythology of Wine. Art is a mythologist, and in addition to The Mythology of Wine, he is also the author of the books The Mythology of Eden and The Mythology of America's Seasonal Holidays. And as I said, Art is a winemaker in his own right with his own vineyard. So he brings that dual expertise in both of those realms to our conversation today. And because this is the grand finale of our first sequence of MythLit webinars, we thought it might be fun to celebrate by enjoying a glass of wine together during the Q&A. So please feel free to join in with whatever celebratory beverage you prefer, whether that is literal or metaphorical wine. But first, Steph will drop the link to The Mythology of Wine in the chat. And Art, before we go further, I would love to invite you to take the virtual microphone and offer any words of greeting or introduction that you'd like before we jump into our discussion.
I think, cheers, everybody.
That's a perfect greeting. Cheers. Okay, so we'll dive into the book in just a minute, and then we'll have time for questions. So please feel free to send in your questions as we go, and include like any comments or thoughts or reflections, and put those in the Q&A with the Q&A button. We'll have just like, chat in the chat, as the name suggests, but anything that you'd like us to lift up for Art to hear or respond to or questions to answer, put those into the Q&A. But first, let's begin with the chat check-in as we do. So open up the chat if you haven't already, and let us know where you're joining from. And if you have any works in progress where you are turning metaphorical water into wine, anything you'd like to share about that, or if you have a favorite myth about wine, what would that be? I'm currently working on an article about myth and marketing, of all things, which sometimes feels like an exercise in summoning spirit into the mundane. And my favorite sacred story about wine is that image of turning water into wine, transforming something plain into something full of flavor and aroma and spirit, right? Art, wondering if you have any favorite myths about wine or any current projects where you're turning water into wine.
I too like the one about turning water into wine, because that is something that Jesus reportedly did, and it's also something, as I think I'll get to, Dionysus did that on many occasions. So that's pretty fun. I like it for the same reasons you do. It's just metaphorical about transformation.
Steph, how about you?
The myths that come to mind for me with wine is all the Dionysian revelry and all of that. Yeah, yeah. And the current project I'm working on is a lecture, so I'm trying to pull together pieces for a lecture. So, yeah. And the chat is going here. We've got people from all over. So, Arkansas, Washington, India, um, someone saying that sounds very interesting, Joanna, to do myth and marketing. Cheers from Chicago, Santa Fe, Washington again. Someone curious about the types of ancient beverages, beer, mead, wine, cider, etc. Which came first? And if like beer, wine was a meal in itself. Long Beach and turning a final manuscript into a book.
Ooh,
Yes.
that's good water into wine.
Yes. Yeah. So
Awesome.
welcome,
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
welcome to everyone and to all the projects. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have time to get into beer and mead and all that. That sounds like its own whole series of webinars. But whatever Art wants to speak to, we can speak to. So, Art, are you ready to jump into our conversation?
Sure.
All right, let's begin. So my first question is kind of foundational. Like, how did you become interested in the mythology of wine, and what led you to write this book?
Well, for there I am. That was my harvest during COVID in my vineyard. I didn't have a haircut for about a year. Yeah, I became interested in mythology probably a couple decades ago, and I researched and wrote about it. So I was on the mythology train, and then I've always been a wine enthusiast. And when I moved here to California, I was able to plant my own vineyard and make my own wine. And once I understood what's involved with that, I became more appreciative about mythology involving wine. And as I got more into that, I realized that it's real wine and grapevines and so forth are really instrumental in developing individual personal religion and spirituality and developing corresponding mythology, especially things like the notions of salvation and afterlife and a happy one at that. So that pretty much summarizes it. I think we can get into some more of that later.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was a mutual arising, the interest in myth and wine kind of
Yeah, it's
built
kind of
up
like the title
together.
of the book, you know.
Right. Yeah. So, curious to get us started, how and why did wine and grapes and grapevines become linked with myth and religion, especially in the ancient world?
Uh, one big reason is because of the way that wine works and how it gets made. Because in the ancient times, people didn't understand how fermentation worked. So when fermentation happened spontaneously through the yeast, and people drank the wine, you know, they had the effect of drinking it, and they didn't know how it happened. It was magical, and they figured that some divine forces at work and that some deity must be behind the process. And given that, people thought that when they drank wine, that they were connecting with the deity and something holy. And so then they thought, well, the gods must drink wine too. And then so you end up with making offerings to the deities because they drink wine. And then since the wine was divine, you know, that got traced back to the grapes and the grapevines as well. Also, grapevines, because of their nature, um, they go dormant in the winter and then they revive in the spring, like a lot of vegetation. So it became a natural symbol for death and rebirth, which is a classic mythological theme. But in grapevines, it's a little more accented because people are involved in pruning the grapes in the winter and involved in making sure that there's actually good wine. It's not what happens in the wild naturally. So wine became kind of a similar symbol for higher civilization, I would say. And that as to the nature of divine, it was really centered around the life force, and we hear about indestructible life, Zoe in Greek. And that's what was at work, and that's what underlay the death and rebirth motif. And so that's why wine got placed in tombs in the ancient world, because it helped facilitate the rebirth, and it also helped the people in their afterlife be a lot happier, and they had wine to drink. So that's about it, I think.
I'm appreciating and I know the book gets into this, but your observation about how humans participate in the transformation, in the rebirth of grapes on a grapevine, and how the work of helping that happen is so much like a spiritual practice, you know.
Yeah.
And I know the book gets into it. Yeah, sorry,
That's
go
how
ahead.
viticulturalists and winemakers have that kind of feeling sometimes when they're at work. I know I do.
I would love to hear more about that, but we can save that I know we've got lots and lots of questions to get to. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So a little bit more in terms of like the content of the book, what readers will find in this book. Wondering if you could share about how wine mythology is structured in the Hebrew Bible, what Christianity refers to as the Old Testament.
Yeah, it turned out more than I even expected that a lot of the wine mythology is biblical. So I spent a lot of time about that in the book, both the Hebrew Bible and later on the New Testament. Um, in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, there's a bunch of unrelated stories involving wine. We get the Garden of Eden, which I want to get to, and then the story of Noah's drunkenness, and then Melchizedek greeting Abraham with wine and bread, and Jacob's blessing of Judah. And then in the story of Joseph and the Pharaoh in Egypt, the wine steward, or Psalm, if you will, played a key role in that story. But then beginning with Exodus and throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and we get this consistently again and again, they keep hammering away at it. There's this metaphorical structure that gets built up. And the metaphors are applied to the land, the promised land, to the chosen people, the Israelites, the punishment of sinners, the Messiah, and finally salvation in the kingdom of God. And more specifically, the chosen people, they escape from Egypt, and at that point they're called the vine. Okay, so the vine is the chosen people, and that vine gets transplanted into the promised land. And the promised land, which is now Israel, is thought of in metaphors as a vineyard. And it's God that gave it to him and is ultimately the owner of it, right? But the people are its steward, and they're supposed to take good care of it. And they do that by following God's law. And if you do all that, then the vineyard will prosper, the grapes will be good, and the wine will be great. And if you don't do that, then the vineyard will go bad, and so will the grapes, and so will the wine. And we all know what happened. They didn't follow the law, and so everything went bad, and the Jews ended up getting exiled from that vineyard to Babylon. And then the scripture says that Yahweh is going to punish the sinners, and on Judgment Day. And after that, the good people will remain, and they will live in the kingdom of God, which is in Israel, centered in Jerusalem. And to accomplish this, Yahweh will send the Messiah, who will render judgment and rule over the kingdom. And in the book of Jeremiah, this Messiah is called the righteous branch of David. And that branch is thought of as a grapevine. And so the grapevine was actually the tree of the Messiah in that thinking. And that's why Jesus in the Gospel of John was able to say, I am the vine, because he's reaching back to that older mythology. So anyway, once the kingdom is established, in the book of Isaiah, it says there's going to be an eschatological celebratory feast which features well-filtered wine. And of course, in the kingdom, there's no war. So this is where you get the famous passage about turning swords into plowshares. But in that same passage, which people forget about, it says that spears are going to be changed into pruning hooks for grapevines. So the implication there is that the kingdom of God is going to feature nice vineyards with healthy grapevines and good wine. And the imagery, which you see in various passages, it literally says that the people are going to be lounging around under the shade of their grapevines, sipping sweet wine. So that's the kind of the overall picture that we have in the Hebrew Bible.
So it's just as summing up, it sounds like, you know, that the image is throughout. It's extremely important and continuous.
Yeah,
So
it's again and again, they keep beating on it. Yeah.
yeah.
Almost beat it to death.
So kind of going back to the beginning, to Eden, I'm going to set you up with a question that I think I'm going to know the answer to, having read the book, right? But in Eden, was the forbidden fruit a grape in your view?
Yeah, well, guess what? It's not an apple. Actually, apples didn't grow in that part of the world, at least in ancient times. Actually, the tradition that it was an apple arose only in medieval times in order to make a pun in Latin, which of course didn't exist when the story was written. And the pun is that on the words for bad or evil in Latin, which is malus, and the word for apple, which is malum. In the story, the term that's used for the forbidden fruit is peri, which is a general term for fruit in Hebrew, but it can include grapes. And we know it includes grapes because there's this story where when the Hebrews are stuck in the wilderness before they enter the promised land, Moses sends some spies to Canaan to check out the promised land to see how it is. And they come back with this huge cluster of grapes, so big that they have to carry it between them on a pole. And that is described as a peri. So we know that that term's used for grapes. And then there's a bunch of old apocryphal Jewish apocryphal and rabbinical literature which asserts that the forbidden fruit is a grape. You see it in the third Baruch, the Talmud Sanhedrin, and the Mishnah. And so I agree with that. And there's two basic reasons for that. One is, as I think we've started to see, eating grapes, by implication, drinking wine, it will confer upon the person godlike insight and knowledge. And that's exactly what happens to Eve when she eats the grape. Okay, she acquires the knowledge of good and evil. And we can be reasonably sure that it's not another fruit because the other fruits don't have a high enough sugar content and therefore not as much potential alcohol to have the kind of effect that grapes or wine do in order to acquire that godlike knowledge. So the grape is the most logical fruit. And we can see this even more because grapevines and grapes were the classic crop in Canaan, and wine was their biggest product, which was exported throughout the Mediterranean. And the author of the Eden story, which you know is called the Yahwist, he was always engaging in anti-Canaanite polemic, and he's doing this in the Eden story too. And he normally criticizes drunken festivals of the Canaanites. And we see that when Eden is eating the grape. And this theory, you can take it further, which I do, because in Canaan you had serpent veneration and you had worship of goddesses. And the serpent, of course, fits into the story as another evil figure. And then I argue that Eve is there's a kind of goddess standing behind the Eve figure. So you have the fruit as a grape, the serpent alluding to serpent veneration, and Eve an allusion to goddess worship. And it all fits together pretty nicely in the Eden story.
So I want to thank you for that interpretation because I love it. And when I read it in the book, you know, it kind of it changed the feeling tone of the story for me. It kind of it turned original sin into original sacrament in a way, just you know, in my imagination.
Yeah, it was kind of it's a step up for people, not a step down. It's a kind of enlightenment, and I think that's probably, you know, you see that in a lot of myths. They take some substance or go through something, and they become more enlightened.
Transformation, right?
Which is what they did, because actually later on in the Hebrew Bible, the knowledge of good and evil is actually something good. And people are supposed to have it because they need it in order to comply with the law of Yahweh. It's a necessary feature, and people attain that knowledge when they're 20 years old, but like kids don't have it yet. And so in the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve were not fully conscious yet. They were like little kids who weren't in a position to understand that. And it's the grape that gave them that ability.
So curious, if coming to this interpretation changed you at all? Like, did you feel differently about the story before and after this interpretation? Or any, or, you know, what was that like? What was it like to the realization?
Yeah, when I was writing it, I don't talk about this in the book, but I kind of analogized it a little bit to Jungian psychology, where you're digging deep into yourself, and you have this sort of unconscious energy coming to you, which helps give you more individuation, wholeness, or whatever, and a more enlightened mentality. And that's kind of what happened with Eve. It was a step up.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about Dionysus.
Right.
So the question, yes, everyone's excited. So the question is, how did Dionysus mythology evolve from ancient Greece into the Hellenistic and Roman eras?
Yeah, well, originally he wasn't originally in Greece. The scholars think he probably came either through Crete or Lydia, which is in Turkey nowadays, Turkey, and in way ancient, like the archaic or pre-archaic times, you didn't really have a grape industry or wine industry in Greece. It came from the outside, and so I like to think of the evolution of Dionysus into maybe 4 stages. And the first is when he arrived in Greece from wherever it was, and he struggled to gain a foothold following, because there was established religion already, and he had to fight his way in. And he was originally a broader vegetation god, and he was, we mentioned beer, meat, and honey before. And he did actually, from what we can tell, he did represent all of these things. And then as wine developed in Greece, he became the wine god preeminently. And his staff evolved at that time. It's called a thyrsus. Actually, in the image there, the maenad is holding it. And it was twined with ivy and topped with a pine cone. You can't see that here. Which of course are evergreen, which again represents indestructible life. And then eventually a twine grapevine was on it as well. And then the second phase would be when he actually emerged as the wine god, and his original followers were married women known as maenads, which means the raving ones. Could you hold that first one up first? I want to mention. Yeah, there we go. And some men venerated Dionysus too, but they were not allowed in these private rituals. It was a kind of a ladies' night out kind of thing. Because in the middle of the winter, on one night, the Maenads would go into the mountains dressed more or less like this in the image, and they would drink wine, but not to real excess. But they engaged in a kind of ecstatic dance, beat drums, and there was music and stuff, and they just worked themselves up into an ecstatic state, which gave them that experience of the god. And then this ritual, it was like in mid to late February, and so spring was around the corner, and so the ritual served to summon Dionysus from his winter abode in the underworld so that he would appear and then revive the grapevines and other vegetation. And so he was known as the god who appears. So that's interesting. And then the next phase, the third, is when he became accepted into mainstream Greek religion. And this is where he became venerated in the large cities. And now you didn't have private things with the women in the forest anymore. They still did that too, but now we had public Dionysus festivals in the cities. And men were now allowed to participate. And like in the first phase, it was connected with Dionysus reappearing in the spring. But at this point, he's already there. He just appeared, and so you have these processions in the festivals where an image of him is put on some kind of cart or something, and it's paraded through the streets. So he's already there. And this is the phase also where he becomes an Olympian deity, and you start seeing him in vase art, which is like here, where they're showing some. This is presumably at the urban festival. There's an image of Dionysus in the middle, and some ladies are getting ready to serve wine, and then on either side of them, we have Maenads dancing away. And then in the fourth phase, this is in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, we had these people formed these Dionysus clubs, associations, and they celebrated Dionysiac mysteries. Because as I said before, there's this death and rebirth theme. And so they would venerate the god privately in their little groups. A lot of it was indoors. These clubs were usually sponsored by rich people. So they had these really nice houses and villas where they did this kind of thing. And they also had their processions as well. And these rituals in the mysteries focused on Dionysus as a personal savior god who would accord the celebrants a happy afterlife. And so in these rituals, wine, of course, flowed freely. And that's because they were emulating the afterlife where it was supposed to be happy, right? So it was kind of a self-serving activity there. But, as in practice, the religion and the mythology kind of deteriorated, and these events became more like social events than serious religion. And then, of course, later on in Rome, you started getting the Bacchic events, and that was really a further deterioration of the religion and mythology. So that's kind of where it stands at the end. I don't cover it any further in the book because the mythology kind of stopped there, and so I went to the other things.
The wine clubs fact, I'll say, reminds me of all the, like, you can join the clubs of wineries today, right? Like I live in the Santa Barbara area, and all the wineries around here, you can join the club of the winery, and I think they like deliver wine to your house or something on some
You can, or you can pick it up. Yeah. And I live right in the middle of that here in the Santa Ynez Valley. So yeah, I am guilty. I'm guilty of being a member of, I think, half a dozen wine clubs.
No. There's no guilt here. This is a
Plus,
guilt.
I make my own. So yeah.
No, I mean, I'm just like the connection. It's maybe trivial and maybe there's depth there.
Yeah, in
you know,
theory, it was a lot more than that, but sometimes it didn't amount to more than that. So
right, right. But I'm hearing the echo, I guess I'll say,
yeah,
um, the sacred. And I've been to, a handful of these vineyards, and some of them you feel like you're walking into a temple to Dionysus,
yeah,
not with the pillars and everything, but they're so beautiful, and the wine is treated so carefully. I mean, with care, right?
right.
It's the feeling of the sacred is there.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, okay, so I'm doing what I do, and I'm digressing. So let's go back. Um, okay, so I guess I'm not digressing too far. I'm wondering if you could speak to how the idea of divinity in grapevines and wine plays out in the cult of Dionysus.
Yeah, when you drink wine uh, in the ancient world, you actually felt the impact of the god somatically in your body. Okay, and people thought that that meant that the divinity and the wine god were literally inside you. Okay, and this is really unlike other deities who are kind of aloof, and the rituals are all public and there are sacrifices, but people just observe passively, and they didn't really experience anything. But Dionysus was different because it was an experience, and people felt like they were developing a personal, individual personal relationship with the wine god, who could give an afterlife and therefore was one's individual savior. Okay, this individualistic approach to the religion was quite new, and so wine was a key driver for that, and it was obvious in Dionysiac religion, but as we'll see, it came to be featured again in the case of Christ in early Christianity, because you get the same sort of thing. I mean, you'll hear, I've heard born again Christians tell me, I feel Christ within me. Okay. It's a kind of an emotional state. And I find in that a kind of analogy to the old beliefs concerning Dionysus.
Well, and I think that analogy flows both ways, right? Like in time, the how that sense of having the divine within it appears later in Christianity than in Greek religion, right? But I'm not sure what I'm trying to get at, but I'm sensing the flow both ways, how um it's bigger than either one, I guess, the notion of feeling the divine within. It's bigger than Greek religion, it's bigger than
Yeah,
Christianity.
and of course there are lots of religious practices in the Far East with feel the divine within. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
restricted to the Western tradition at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. But let's I am doing it again. I'm veering off of the topic at hand. So let's talk about how let's go back to the Bible. And you mentioned this a little bit, but wondering about what elements of wine mythology from the Hebrew Bible carry over into the Christian Bible or the New Testament.
Yeah, it does, because I mean, Jesus had a new message, but he did go back to earlier tradition, and so we still have the idea that the paradisal kingdom of God is a kind of vineyard, and people will drink wine there. As I mentioned, Jesus said, "I am the vine," but now it was had a different meaning because before the vine was the chosen people, right? And so it was an ethnic thing. Whereas if Jesus is the vine, then you're being called upon to believe in him. And that opens the religion up to everybody, to the Gentiles in particular, and it's no longer an ethnic thing. Um, so Jesus would say, you can't put new wine into old wineskins, right? And the new wine is his own new message, and you can't quite fit that into the old Jewish tradition. And we also see the wine press being an instrument of the punishment of sinners. We see this especially in the book of Revelation. And then we see imagery of wine, red wine, as blood. We see that in both the Old and New Testaments. And then so when you get to the crucifixion, this picks up the old motif of the punishment of sinners as being involved with wine, as the wine press. And in the book, I have images of that wine press thing. But for here, we have the crucifixion as a kind of grape crush. Okay, his blood is being spilled. It's red. It's like at the winery. And in the bottom is that old story about the Moses spies being coming back from Canaan with a big cluster of grapes. And this shows that in the image it shows that the crucifixion of Christ is kind of the fulfillment of the Old Testament traditions. And so the cluster is being brought back by these two guys on a pole, and Christ is being crucified on a pole. And so it's a crush because he's sinless, right? But he's bearing the sins of others. So the punishment is the same kind as occurred in the Hebrew Bible. And then we have the notion of God's kingdom being a happy vineyard, and that gets carried over too. And so, yeah, here in this image, we see Christ, he's enthroned in heaven, which is being depicted here as a vineyard. So he's there among the grapevines, which is heaven. So that's my answer to that.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you. Well, so we're getting close to time for bringing in some comments and questions from everyone who's here. But just before we do that, wondering if we could circle back to the turning water into wine image again. If you could comment on the mythical aspects of Jesus turning water into wine, and if and how that compares to Dionysus and his wine miracles.
Yeah, and as of the time Jesus came along, in the Mediterranean world, Dionysus religion was the strongest form of personal piety, religion, and spirituality. And so the Christians were claiming much the same thing. And so the early Christian religion and the Dionysiac religion came mano to mano. And so they were in direct competition. And so the early Christian writers took great pains to take on Dionysus and portray Jesus as being superior to him, as well as being superior to the old Judaic religious traditions. So turning water into wine is a big part of this effort, because in Greek literature and mythology, Dionysus turned water into wine several times. Sometimes people would put these empty vases or vases with water in them into a Dionysus temple overnight, and then in the morning it would be full of wine. Or springs would start, wine instead of water would be coming out of springs. This especially happened when at the time of his marriage to Ariadne in Naxos, this supposedly happened. And then in Euripides' play, the Bacchae, a Maenad, takes her thyrsus and stamps it on the ground, and Dionysus causes water to spurt out from the ground. It's kind of like Moses and his staff and water coming out. So for the most part, that happened without any witnesses, like with these temples overnight. So Christians felt compelled to show that Jesus could not only do the same, but do it even better. So he did it in front of witnesses, and of course the wine was superior to the wine that had previously been served. In Dionysus, there was not much talk about the quality of the wine. So there was an opportunity here to hammer home the point about superior wine. And then as to the Judaic traditions in this story, when Dionysus was trying to get established, he had to make the point that he point about his identity. He's divine. He's the God, worship me. And we see that here because this is in the Gospel of John, this is Jesus's first miracle. And throughout the Gospel of John, the point that's hammered home and home again is about Jesus's identity as the Son of God. And so this is the first of these episodes where this is done, and it causes the disciples to believe that he's the Messiah. And of course, the idea about superior wine means that, or implies that Jesus's own message is superior to the old traditions, both Judaic traditions and Dionysus. And then he made the wine in these big stone pots that were used in the Jewish rituals for purification. They contained holy water, okay, from running streams. And, according to Jewish tradition, what Jesus did was a great misuse of these pots. It was a sacrilege to have wine in these pots that were reserved for holy water. So he was really challenging the Pharisees and the priesthood in this respect. And he was showing that he was doing this out of compassion for the people at the wedding who were running out of wine. And he didn't want them to be embarrassed. They were his friends, apparently. And so he did this for them. And finally, he made a lot of wine, like way more than what was needed for the wedding. It was like, if you do the measurements, it's something like between 2 and 3 regular barrels of our kind of wine. And it's just probably a wedding, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen people. And this abundance was a way of symbolizing God's blessing. Because remember, in the Hebrew Bible traditions, wine was abundant. That means God favored you, right? So this implies that God supports Jesus, okay, more so than anybody else. So that's all I have to say on that, at least for now.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And that's kind of a perfect segue to let's hear some applause in the chat for Art and for writing this book, and join me in raising a glass to Art and to this book, and to Stephanie for everything she's done, and for everyone who's participated in the MythLit webinars so far.
Yes, and to the faiths and graces and to the audience. Thank you for your attention.
So before we go to the Q&A, Art, do you have any wine recommendations in the Santa Barbara area?
Well, actually, I think you're drinking Hitching Post. That's a good one to start with. I like Foxen is good. Beckman for one varieties.
Great, I'm writing this down. Foxen, and who else?
Ken Brown is really good
Ken Brown, okay.
for Pinot Noir, Syrah, and Chardonnay. Tensley is good for Syrah. If you like Grenache, Cayena is good. Kaena. It's a Hawaiian word.
We're recording this, right, Steph? Okay, good.
That's a good start. I mean, there are some more of these more boutique wines which are really hard to get, which we don't need to mention those right now.
Okay, well, we'll connect at some point about that. Awesome. Okay, so Steph,
mine is not for sale, unfortunately. So you have to.
You have to have a party. Have a party, Art.
Have another party, yeah.
Oh, can you show your bottle? Don't you have your bottle? Do you have a bottle?
Oh, yeah. This is like
there it is. Yes.
Like the one at the beginning. Only that I think that one was a Syrah from my own vineyard, which I call Mythic Vineyard, by the way, and which is appropriate because I live on Valhalla Drive, which intersects with Odin Way and Freya Drive. So this is my Chardonnay from 2022. It's from a vineyard called Good Child Vineyard in Foxen Canyon.
Nice. All right, so everyone, now is the time. If you have any questions or comments for Art, type them into the Q&A. And Steph, do we have any questions coming in?
We do, yes.
All right.
So our first one's from Maggie. Hi, Maggie. And she's asking how you feel about biodynamic winemaking. She said it seems so mythological to her with the rituals and sanctity of all living things.
Yeah. Hi, Maggie. Thanks for your question. Yeah, I drink a lot of biodynamic wine. One of the ones that I mentioned, Beckman, is all biodynamic. That's quite popular here. And what's not biodynamic is either organic or sustainable. And like 98% of the wine here is sustainable. So, the difference between these three types, sustainable, organic, and biodynamic, is kind of a matter of degree. And it has to do with the practices. And just because you do one versus the other doesn't mean the resulting wine is going to be better. Um, I think organic is better because it's going to be totally healthy. Okay, you're not going to put anything bad into the by fertilizing the wines or pesticides or whatever. It's all natural. Biodynamic introduces there's a lot of controversy about whether that really helps, but there is indeed more kind of a reverence and spirituality to those practices by putting the stuff in the cow horns and following the lunar cycle and whatnot. And so I think, at least for the winemakers, it makes it more of a spiritual, meaningful experience, which is good. I mean, that's what I was talking about in the main talk, right? Uh, and so I can't say I've ever had a bad biodynamic wine. But most of what I drink is either organic or sustainable or biodynamic. So.
Well, on that same theme of the process of making the wine, we have a question from Margot about would like to hear how tending grapes and your vineyard feeds your spiritual life.
Yeah, it's kind of fun because when I was growing up in a rural area, our family always had a vegetable garden, and I would always tend that more than anybody else in the family when I was growing up as a kid and as a teenager, and I really enjoyed it. It was always fun to spend some time, kind of sacred time, out there doing that. And then when I was living in the big city, I missed that. And then when I came back to California here and I planted the vineyard, I kind of regained that original experience that I used to have as a kid. And it's quite nice. You're creating something, you're engaging with plants and the sunshine and whatnot, trying to make some things better. It's quiet time to yourself. At times, you could be frustrated with this or that, but 90% of it is very pleasurable and it's healthy. You're out in the fresh air and get a little bit of exercise. So I really like it.
Is that a daily activity for you, tending the vines? Does that have to happen every day or?
Almost. Not in the wintertime, of course, but once the shoots start growing, you usually have to maintain them, tend them almost daily in order to keep them in control, make sure they're healthy, and that you have to thin them out a little bit. Otherwise, there gets too much moisture in there and you could get mildew and whatnot. And you don't want to have too many clusters of grapes because then the too many clusters are going to use up the energy in the vine. So you need to have fewer clusters so that the energy is more concentrated and the flavors of the grape are more concentrated, and you'll get better wine.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Can I
All right.
ask a question?
Sure.
Piggybacking on that, do you find that work of tending the vineyard becomes part of your creative process at all, like your writing process, or are they completely unrelated, completely separate?
I think obviously when I was writing the Mythology of Wine book, it certainly did. But on when I'm writing about other topics, I probably not directly, but I think it does form part of the nice background, mental background for the creative process. And then having said that, I think I will be writing more about Dionysus and Christ. So I think that'll come back a little more directly when I'm doing that.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we're going to go back to the Garden of Eden. This is an interesting question from Mike here. And we're talking about the forbidden fruit. He's asking, when did wine change from forbidden fruit to sacrament?
Yeah. The forbidden fruit, that's a Hebrew Bible tradition. It doesn't, at that time, it wasn't a forbidden fruit anywhere else. And then it changed from being forbidden. Well, in the Christian, when Christianity first developed, that's when it became a sacrament. But at the time, I don't think the early Christians were thinking that the forbidden fruit was a grape. I think a lot of Jews did. I don't think the Christians paid much attention to whether it was a forbidden fruit. And then when we get all this material from Jesus talking about he's the vine and using wine at the Last Supper, things like that, then the grape became necessary and wine became necessary because it was part of what Jesus did at the Last Supper, which is what led to the Eucharist ritual. And so at that point, the grape was necessary, and that's why the early wine industry in Europe developed, because it developed amongst the monasteries because they needed it for the Eucharist. And of course, they produced a lot more than what they needed for the Eucharist. The monks drank wine every day, and they sold some of the wine to other people, and they allowed the peasants who had their own wine making, they rented out the wine equipment to these people so that the monastery could get more income. So it became quite an industry amongst the Christian community in early Europe.
Fascinating. It's like commerce goes along with mythic. Okay, yeah, and then now we're kind of moving into Greek and Roman myth, and this is from Miriam, asking about kind of the difference from the Greek worship of Dionysus and how that moved into Rome with all the Bacchic cults and things of that nature. What was the transformation there, or was the god similar?
Yeah, I think first of all, the name I should mention is the name Bacchus and Bacchoi is actually a Lydian name, which is one of the places where the god may have come from, and it was sometimes used in ancient Greece, which is why Euripides' play is called the Bacchoi, right? But it became more the common term for the god in Rome than it did in Greece, and so that's why you get Bacchic festivals in Greece. And there's another god in Rome called Liber, which means the liberator, which is kind of what Dionysus did. He liberated people's consciousness. Okay, but that kind of faded away and then became Bacchus. And Bacchus in Rome didn't really have any mythology. It just kind of was a carryover from these drinking parties of the last stage of Dionysus religion that I described in the Hellenistic and Roman era. So there was a lot of real, drunken debauchery there going on, which is not really traditional with the Dionysus religion. I mean, there was a lot of drunkenness, of course, but there was something else going on behind that was more meaningful.
Right. Right. The party without the religion underneath it.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay. Is there a wine that you could buy today that would be close to the taste and texture of those ancient wines?
I'm aware that some people have made some efforts to do that, but I'm not aware of anyone that's available here, even online. I know one thing you can find is what's called mission wine here in California, which is the kind of wine that they made at the the missions up and down California, and that was made from what's called the mission grape. And I have tried that. It's not very good, but it's interesting to try. I think by most estimations, the old wine probably wouldn't be worth tasting anyway. It really wasn't very good. And they had, because there are all kinds of impurities in it, for one thing. And for which reason the people felt like they had to spice it up with ingredients. They would put all kinds of spices in it to make it taste good. That's how you ended up having Retsina, right, from the Greek wine, which is made from pitch or flavored with pitch. So yeah, it would be interesting to try it, but I probably wouldn't want to drink that stuff more than once.
Awesome. That's kind of interesting how flavors change and evolve. Yeah.
Most of the wine was fairly sweet, though. And one reason is it probably didn't ferment to completion.
Ah.
Or you would put honey. Sometimes you would put honey in it to make it sweeter too.
Like during fermentation or after? Like to
after in the winemaking. Yeah, after the fermentation, you would put honey into it. And you could make this grape syrup that was just syrup, and then you could put that grape syrup in the wine. And actually, in the reference to the Bible, in the biblical reference to the land of milk and honey, the honey, some people think, is not real honey, but it's this kind of grape syrup that was used to add to wine to make it nice and sweet.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm feeling lucky to be alive today. We have good wines. So
I should mention that in the ancient world, wine was important because the alcohol in it protected you against maladies. Okay, microbes and bacteria and whatever. Though alcohol would kill the bacteria, which is why wine and water were mixed. And a lot of the wine was not healthy. And so you talk about mixing wine into water, but people thought of it sometimes the other way around. You know, you were adding wine to water to make it healthy rather than adding water to wine to dilute it so it wouldn't be as strong.
Oh, interesting. Well, I can't wait for the next book to come out because this one's amazing. And thank you so much, Art. And everyone, let's hear it again in the chat. Let's hear some art appreciation. And if there is a word or a phrase from today that you'll carry with you after we close, please feel free to put that in the chat as well. And Steph, can we share the slide? Yes, exactly. You read my mind. That's the slide I was going for. So here are some next steps for you to consider regarding the mythology of wine. You can read the book for one thing, share it. It makes a great gift, especially for wine lovers. And if you feel so moved, put a review on Amazon. That is how Amazon finds books in searches, right? The algorithm of Amazon looks for books that have lots of reviews. So we always encourage people to review the books that we talk about in MythLit so that we can kind of get the word out so more people will read them. And this is how you can connect with the Fates and Graces. You can visit our homepage, fatesandgraces.com, to subscribe to our email list. We are currently plotting our next series of webinars and some other fun community building events. And the email list is the best way to stay up to date with what we're planning. Stephanie and I want to extend another super special thank you to the Fates and Graces patrons whose monthly support is making it possible for this webinar to happen, for the whole entire MythLit series to happen, and to be free. Our patrons are invited to our quarterly Zoom check-ins around the solstices and equinoxes, where we catch up on what we're all working on, what we're reading, what we're thinking about, whatever. So if you would like to join that circle and support this work, you can visit the URL on this slide, patreon.com/ mythological.com/join/fates and graces. And again, thank you so much to our patrons. And everyone, please join me in the chat thanking our patrons who not only support the Fates and Graces, but also support this whole community. And that is just about it for today and for our first sequence of MythLit webinars. Our final announcement today is that Stephanie and I will be at the Mythologium, which this year is hosted by the International Society of Mythology. And we're going to share a presentation about marketing for mythologists. So we hope to see you there. Meanwhile, keep reading, keep writing, and keep celebrating the field of mythological literature.